Well, good morning, everyone. We live in a culture that is driven by the desire to maximise pleasure and comfort and minimise pain and suffering. So as you think about Christian faith and life, you might ask, why would anyone choose a life that guarantees increased suffering? That's like going to the shops and having the vendor tell you, for you, a special price today, 20% extra. Who would buy that? Yet that is precisely what Jesus promises to those who follow him. If we follow Jesus, the Bible tells us we will experience the same sufferings as everyone else in this broken world, plus persecutions, plus the sufferings that come because of following Jesus. I'll have a sign-up sheet available at the end of the service. Peter writes to believers who are under pressure, facing the threat of unfair suffering and perhaps organised persecution because they follow Jesus. 1 Peter's treatment of the theme of Christian suffering is the reason one theologian has suggested that it might be the most important book of the Bible for Christians in the 21st century. If you don't need this book today, you'll need it someday. Well, what are you living for? Peter urges us to live for God and to live for the will of God, even if that involves suffering. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body has finished with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. Therefore, Peter continues to reflect on the suffering of Christ and its implications for those who follow Christ. In the letter, Peter has already held up Jesus as a model of suffering for doing what is right, an example for us to follow. Peter has pointed to the suffering of Christ, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring us to God, as the means of our salvation, not empty suffering, but suffering that achieves God's purposes. Peter has pointed to the victory of Jesus over unjust suffering in his death and resurrection and ascension as an encouragement to believers who suffer unfairly for Christ's sake, because their suffering too will serve God's purposes in their lives and in the world, and their suffering too will end in sharing Christ's glory. Peter has written that it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. And here in chapter 4, he builds on the argument that it is better to suffer unjustly than to sin. Therefore, arm yourselves, he writes. Christian life is a hard struggle, a kind of a battle, and sometimes the Bible writers use military language for that fight. So he says, arm yourselves. And the weapon you need is the right attitude, an attitude that chooses suffering over sin, faithfulness over comfort, obedience over ease. Did you notice that Peter contrasts living for evil human desires, plural, with living for the will of God, singular? Why does he put it that way, do you think? There are many desires that can pull us in different directions in life, but only one thing that should direct our lives, only one thing that we should live for, and that is the will of God, his good purposes for us and for his world and for his glory. Catherine and I spoke with an old friend recently, a woman we've known since she was a teenager. She grew up in a Christian home, but in her young adult years she didn't live Christianly, and that has had lots of dramatic consequences in her life. Now she looks back on those years with a sense of sadness and regret and guilt. And as she looks forward, she has a deep desire to live for the will of God. What do you want to live the rest of your life for? Peter asks this morning. For you've spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing and detestable idolatry. It's quite the list, isn't it? The first 5 terms that Peter includes in his list of typical sins of the first century pagan world, those words all describe destructive behaviours that show a lack of self-control, and they result in harm both to self and to others. Perhaps that list doesn't resemble your own pre-Christian life very much at all. Perhaps it does. Or perhaps you don't really remember a time when you didn't consider yourself a Christian. But we all know what it is to have hearts that turn inwards on themselves in love for self rather than outwards in love for God and for others. The last sin in Peter's list, idolatry, is a more distinctively Judeo-Christian concern, grounded in the belief that there is just one true and living God, and that it is wrong to worship anyone or anything else, to give anyone or anything else the first place in our commitments, in our affections. In the first century, in the time of Peter's original readers, the refusal of Christians to engage in some of the behaviours of the society around them, including their refusal to worship the Greco-Roman gods, and in particular, their refusal to burn incense to the Roman emperor, made them unpopular at best and objects of persecution at worst. Well, in the 21st century, the exclusive claims of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the claim of Jesus that he is the only way to the Father, that trusting in and following him is the only path to salvation, those claims are still unpopular, aren't they? Whether in the face of materialistic atheism or in the face of religious pluralism. They are claims that can get you in trouble, make you unpopular, and maybe worse. Peter continues, they are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. Perhaps you've had that experience as a Christian of being in some context where the group behaviour has been to do something that you think as a Christian you can't do, and when you refrain, you've been rejected or attacked for that. But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the spirit. Peter writes elsewhere in the letter that following Jesus means living as strangers and aliens, or foreigners and exiles in the world, people who don't really fit in here. Most of you have had the experience of living as foreigners. Many in our church have had the experience of living as asylum seekers as well, facing the challenge of standing out in the society around you, not quite fitting in. Have you had the experience of people giving you a hard time because your Christian beliefs and behaviour make you stand out? Following Jesus means being willing to stand out, and if necessary, to suffer unfairly for it. In Mexico, where we were missionaries for a time, we learnt sadly that in some parts of the country, particularly some of the rural parts of southern Mexico, evangelical Christians were persecuted by the local Catholic community because they refused to participate in local saints' days and other practices they believed were not compatible with the Scriptures. The persecution was driven by a complex mix of religious and social and economic factors. We heard stories of houses having their essential services cutting off the power and the water and the gas, of churches being burnt down, even of Christians being imprisoned, sometimes for years on false charges. When your Christian faith makes you stand out from the society around you, whether that's another religious society or a secular society, that difference can attract fierce rejection. Well, ultimately, Peter writes, those who reject Christianity, who reject Christians, who reject Christ himself, will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. And here's another one of those tricky verses in 1 Peter, and we might ask, okay, what is Peter talking about here when he writes about the gospel being preached even to those who are now dead? What does he mean? Karen Jobes captures it well, I think. She writes that because people will be judged even after physical death, that means death is not the end of the story. And more importantly, death does not stop the gospel's message of forgiveness and judgment from being effective, which is an encouragement to Christians who are suffering for their faith in this life, and a warning to those who might be rejecting the gospel and those who hold to it. In the context of an unbelieving world, living for God means being willing to stand out, living for God's will rather than for evil human desires, and being willing to suffer rather than sin. Well, next Peter writes about living for God, living in light of Jesus' suffering and victory, not in the context of an unbelieving world, but in the context of the community of faith, in the church. Peter has just written about the one who will judge the living and the dead. We must live, he writes, in light of the end. The end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. In the great story of history, in the great story of the Bible, there is just one final act left in the drama of salvation, and that is the act that will happen when Jesus returns to save and judge, to establish God's kingdom fully and to set the world right. So Peter writes, the end of all things is near. There's just one great act left in the drama. How should we respond? Be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. And if you know your New Testament, you might know that Peter is reflecting the words of Jesus, who said to his followers that they need to watch and pray. If you've read through the whole of the New Testament, you you might have noticed that it places a great emphasis on our future hope. Perhaps you've heard the expression, some people are so heavenly minded that they are of no earthly good. Have you heard that expression? It's kind of picturing a religious person who's so taken up with their religious concerns that they're no use in real life. That is not the perspective of the New Testament. Here Peter urges us to live in light of the end, because it makes an enormous difference to how we live life in this world. Listen to this comment from Karen Jobes. A belief that the future is full of hopelessness, despair and futility becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when people live today as if that future were true. On the other hand, hope in a future that is meaningful and assured produces the confidence to live each day with that future in view. Do you see the difference? So with our promised future in view, prayerfully looking forward to it, how should we live each day? Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Peter may have in mind a verse from the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. Covering over sins doesn't mean covering up sins. There are times when sins need to be exposed and dealt with. That's why, as a church, we have a strong commitment to safe ministry. That's why the diocese has an active program seeking to prevent violence against women. There are times when sin needs to be exposed, brought into the light, and dealt with, punished even. But deep love for each other that covers over sins means when we feel personally hurt by someone else at church, not responding in kind when we are wronged, not fanning the flames of a conflict or pouring fuel on the fire of a disagreement so that it gets bigger, not speaking ill of people behind their backs when we feel that they've done us some wrong, giving up the evil human desire for revenge. Love each other deeply. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Well, how can we offer cheerful hospitality to one another at church? We can do it by staying for morning tea and investing some time in offering our company, our encouraging conversation to one another, or serving one another over morning tea. We can offer hospitality by welcoming visitors, by spending time with people at church who aren't just from our family or our close friends or perhaps our cultural group. We can do it by inviting other church members into our homes or out for a meal. I think talking over food is one of the most basic expressions of hospitality that we can extend to one another. And in a multicultural, multilingual church like All Saints, we can offer hospitality to one another by speaking a shared language when we're in a group, so that everyone can be part of the conversation. Be alert and of sober mind so that you can pray. Love each other deeply. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Peter has one more instruction about living in light of the end in the church community. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. God has graciously given us all gifts, different ways that we can serve others, and he expects us to use them. You all have some way that you can serve one another, perhaps many ways. The combination of speaking and serving, in Peter's words here, encompasses everything we do, whether in word or in deed. What gifts has God given you to serve others? Are you using them? Speaking the very words of God may be a reference to the ministry of preaching and teaching in particular. Whether in that context or in our informal conversations as we encourage one another in the faith, Peter is saying as we share the gospel, we should speak what God has revealed about himself, not our own speculations. When we serve others with the gifts God has given, Peter says we should serve with God's strength for God's praise. The purpose of serving isn't boasting or hoping that others will think highly of us or speak well of us. The purpose of serving is so that God will be praised in all things. So in the church community, living in light of the end means getting your thinking right, praying, loving and welcoming and serving one another. And living in light of the end in the context of the wider world means being willing to stand out, even when that means choosing suffering over sin, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen.